Good day, Brigade. This is Bahbi coming at you with a new episode here. We're going to be doing an ideology of the month because we haven't really done one for April, and the past couple weeks have been really confusing on how we're going to do that because March had 5 weeks there and it threw everything off a little bit. Anyways, we're going to do one here for you, and we're going to do a particularly interesting idea with the ideology of the month. In fact, we're going to change the name of this whole thing to Political Concept of the Month because what we're talking about is really more of a concept than a particular ideology. And today we're talking about Stratocracy. Mostly to give us a little bit of an easier thing, and mostly because, well, I want to expand on some new ideas. But before we get into that, first a fact. Did you know the Salvation Army is actually an independent religion? It adopts heavily from Christianity and is arguably an offshoot of it, but yeah, the Salvation Army is its own religion and works tirelessly to help communities and individuals affected by alcoholism, homelessness, and that kind of thing. A very, very focused religion, more focused on supporting the people. And quite frankly, we approve. Anyway, on with the show. So, like we said, we're going to be covering Stratocracy today, and what is Stratocracy? Well, we find the word first appears with usage from the political theorist Robert Filmer in 1625, this being preceded by Stratocratia by Claudius Salmasius in reference to the Commonwealth of England. So what exactly were they referring to? Well, they were kind of referring to a mode of organization in which the military kind of forms the government. And I don't mean like kinda, I mean it is. Basically, a very simple way to sum it up, and if you're familiar with Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, we'll be getting into this a little bit later, we can basically summarize it to service equals citizenship. Basically, if you want voting rights or the ability to get into public office or anything like that, you need to serve in some capacity for the military. Now, it could be like a bureaucratic thing, you could be out on the front lines, you could be doing commanding stuff, it really doesn't matter specifically, you just have to be a part of the military in some way, shape, or form. Thus, things like voting rights and all that, you gotta stick it with a citizenship that has the caveat of if you want it, you've gotta serve. Kind of like a weird conscription way. It should be important to note that, sorry for that weird sound, it should be important to note that it's not fascism. It lacks very essential elements to fascism, such as the need for a strong belief of a nationalist origin mythos, a sense of ultranationalism. That's not to say that these things can't be present in a stratocracy, but it's not essential. You also have the idea of a rallying hero or basically only guy can fix a society idea. That doesn't also exist in stratocracy. It doesn't. And appears to have no desire for ethnic or racial division or anything like that, because that's something that depends more on the individual and culture of society using the mode of stratocracy. Additionally to all this, it differs from an authoritarian regime as it is a state ruled by the military as opposed to a regime using the military to enforce the rule of an otherwise civilian rulership. It really is more of its own form of governmental organization, kind of like you would say oligarchy or democracy or things like that. Now, usually when you have such a thing, you have a system that would likely tend towards more of a nationalistic economic policy, favoring a degree of mobilization of the military. Because, well, your military kind of acts as your apparatus, so it's going to support itself first and foremost. Without it, you don't really have an effective governing apparatus in this kind of system. Social policies would likely be ones that would be expanding the military's role with concern to domestic affairs, though to what capacity that would depend on the individual culture and policy tendencies. Again, it's definitely more of a power distribution method and just focuses more on military. Its little details are really dependent upon the culture and political climate, but due to the fact that this power would be held among military vets, current soldiers, and commanders, it really wouldn't be unreasonable to think that these values held in the military would likely permeate through all sectors of society. So, has a society ever really achieved a stratocracy? In its purest essence, no. Not really, no. However, there have been very close examples. And one of the major ancient examples, and you're probably thinking about it right now, is Sparta. A society that was very focused on its military discipline to the point where it literally left its children in a sink or swim situation. Just when they're born. Now, Sparta wasn't 100% a stratocracy because military soldiers weren't the exclusive power to the whole dynamic of Sparta, but they were the major role, and thus could be argued as a type of stratocracy. You also have the Roman Empire, interestingly enough, in Rome and in the Roman Republic, also hitting some aspects of stratocracy, particularly following the Marian reforms with the formation of the empire, with the army either approving or acquiescing to the accession of an emperor, with the Praetorian Guard playing a particularly decisive role, really up until Constantine decided to abolish it. Which, kind of something that Rome needed after that point. It can also be argued that the American Union is moving towards a stratocracy, with many aspects of our society already putting a great value on the military. In fact, if you look at our annual budget, you'll find that our military spending is greater than that of the next top 15 countries combined. This is a frequent truth. And honestly, we wouldn't be hurt if we decided to move a little bit of it elsewhere. Just a personal opinion on that one. But you can see how it wouldn't be too difficult or much of a stretch for the American Union to move towards a stratocracy, as, aside from the budget thing, many of these politicians that we have actually served in the military in some capacity. Additionally, with increasing investment into military in general, along with these budgets, we can further see how a particular political faction, hint hint nudge nudge, might be willing to increase voting restrictions towards disenfranchising those who have served, all those but who have served, and creating a stratocracy that way. I think we know which ones we're talking about here. But yeah, they tend to be on the more right-wing side of things. And the argument many of these people would use for disenfranchising all those but who served would probably be along the lines of those who were willing to sacrifice their lives for such a thing should be the only ones who really control such a thing. And one could see how this would make sense. It's like, okay, you're willing to put your life on the line for the country. You clearly have a certain degree of passion. You should be willing to govern it in an effective manner. I can see how one might think that, but there are many examples of how this just simply isn't the case. I don't think we need to go into full detail, but some examples would be like Adolf Hitler, who served in the military and then later became a civilian leader of Germany, and well, I don't think we think that guy's the best decision maker. You also have people like Pol Pot, the formation of military juntas that have failed tragically, Augusto Pinochet of Chile, Really, there are a lot of reasons why simply being in the military doesn't make you an effective leader. Anyways, it's really more of a concept that's much more popular in fiction. In fact, we can find a lot of examples of stratocracy in fiction. A few examples you might be familiar with, and I know we've mentioned him before, and we're going to mention him now, Robert Heinlein. Now, Robert Heinlein in particular, we're referring to his book Starship Troopers, one where many people think of the Federation as this organization that is fascist in nature, which is fundamentally wrong, actually. As we've discussed earlier, stratocracy and fascism are not the same. Stratocracy is just another form of organization for a power structure. So, what is the Federation exactly in the Starship Troopers? Well, they were originally formed after a third and really tragic world war from a bunch of soldiers in Aberdeen, Scotland. I'm not going to summarize the whole book here, but please do look it up. Anyways, the Federation puts an incredibly heavy focus on serving the apparatus of the Federation, which is incredibly militarily focused. Now, in order to gain citizenship, you have to put in federal service, which isn't necessarily guaranteeing you have to go into the military, But considering most of the Federation is the military, odds are you're going to end up going through the military in some way, shape, or form. And that is to acquire citizenship, which basically just gives you the right to hold office, the right to vote, and things like that. Now, within Heinlein's description, no, you couldn't be actively serving and still have voting right and all that. You had to be a veteran. You had to have already served. So active military couldn't participate within the political process, and as such, those who were already in like elected positions and such couldn't directly go back into the military right away. Now they could resign their position and then go into the military and things like that, but it's a little bit different than if you were to say, hey, you can serve in the military and be like a senator or something like that. Anywho, some more key fundamental differences between the idea of Heinlein's Federation and an actual fascist state are that they're really, well, they are xenophobic, that is something they have in common, but there isn't any real one supreme leader to the Federation. There's like the Grand Marshal and all that kind of guys and all that stuff, but there's still more of a bureaucratic apparatus to it. There's an actual governance going on, some voting and things like that. Now, what if you're not a citizen? Well, if you're not a citizen, you're still a civilian. You still get to enjoy the rights of basically being within the state and all that. You just don't get to vote or hold public office or things like that. We went into a bit of detail on this one, but it is not the only example of a stratocracy in fiction. In fact, many others have very in-depth buildings of these particular apparatuses? One of those. Another example, and if you're more familiar with anime from like the early 2000s, would be Full Metal Alchemist's nation-state of Amestris. Yes, Amestris is also technically a stratocracy. Hell, this should be pretty freaking obvious given that they call their leader a Führer King. Now, they're largely modeled after the idea of Prussia, but the real focus that should be noted is how their organization runs. Now, by technicality, the nation-state of Amestris does have a civilian government. But the civilian government is largely just a visual puppet to really show what's actually going on with the real government of the military, which is run by the Führer King. And through this, many of these government positions are taken by actual military officials. So the real heavy lifting of governing the state of Amestris comes through the military itself. Now, this is one that takes more of an autocratic approach as opposed to a more parliamentarian or democratic approach, but nevertheless, it is still a form of stratocracy as the military is the ruling state apparatus. So, what are some other examples? This last example is the one we're going to cover because it's the ones we know most. We've been choosing these three examples because they're really the ones we know most. And that third one, and this one might surprise you because it actually kind of surprised me in doing research, is the overall organization of the Earth Kingdom in Avatar: The Last Airbender during the 100-Year War. Yeah. This one kind of surprised me too, but when you think about it, it really does actually kind of make sense. So, what are we talking about? Well, during the 100-Year War, a lot of the small towns and villages and all that throughout the Earth Kingdom kind of formed into loose confederations for mutual defense. And a lot of it was through the organization of local armies and militias who largely took a governing role within all these little small areas. Now, this isn't true of all of the Earth Kingdom, but through a lot of it. And you might be wondering, now why Earth Kingdom? Why didn't you do more? And for this, I really encourage you to watch the series. And sorry for in advance if you had any interest in watching this and hadn't before, but I'm going to spoil it a little bit for you. You can stop it for a minute right here, maybe skip like a few seconds. I'm sorry, we don't know how exactly we're going to be skipping this, but basically, why are these organizing into small little stratocratic organizations? It goes to the whole idea of Long Feng ruling the Dai Li. If you don't know who he is, again, watch the series. But basically, there's kind of a puppet government behind the actual Earth King, who's ruling the military and has largely kept major main forces surrounding the capital so as to protect it and kind of keep a whole illusion thing. Just watch the damn show. You'll see what I mean. But these are by no means the only examples. I mean, if you look at the Mass Effect series, they have a Stratocratic society. If you look at, I think, a couple others right offhand, and any fictionalized society loosely based off of Rome, America, or Russia, like Soviet Russia, odds are they're going to be organized as a Stratocratic society. In spite of not really being a super common thing within the real world, it's a very popular idea within fiction and gets explored like crazy. And quite frankly, I can see why. Stratocracy as a method of organization is quite fascinating. It's an apparatus run by a military, whereas typically you think of a state running the military rather than a military running the state. It kind of gives you ideas and callbacks to the Prussian kingdom, in which they really had a military with a state rather than a state with a military. And this was a common saying around the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Well, 17th and 18th, my apologies. 19th century at that point, yeah. Prussia was starting to form into the North German Confederation. And then later Germany. But you can see how through the evolution of like states like Brandenburg and Prussia and all that, with Sparta, the American Union, and Russia through the Cold War, and how the desire for a need for defense and protection against those around you can lead to more militaristic interference within your political system, whether intended or not. And quite frankly, it's a fascinating thing to study. Now you might be wondering, what is the true closest example we've ever come to a stratocracy? And believe it or not, it's not Sparta, it's not Rome, it's not America, it's not Russia, it's not China. It's probably not even a nation state you're thinking of. But our closest modern equivalent would be the State Peace and Development Council of Myanmar, which ruled the nation from 1997 to 2011. Yeah. And it's fascinating because the way it was organized, it was largely appointed military officials taking on the functions of a government. And it did eventually collapse and lead to a lot of political struggles that are going on even today. That's why we're not going to make any major comments on it. But it is probably the closest modern equivalent to a stratocracy that we had ever gotten to in the world today. It really is fascinating. So, that leads to an interesting question. Is stratocracy actually possible in the world? And that answer is, oh, very much so, if executed properly and done through the right cultural society. For example, you can't have a dictatorship form and then have that run by a civilian administration or anything like that. That negates the principle of stratocracy, and quite frankly, is probably the most common example of what happens with your revolutions and rebellions and all that. It's usually militia groups and guerrillas that are formed from non-military entities or militarized entities of political factions. But you never really see the military kind of taking over and just going with a more, we're going to be the state apparatus. I mean, you do have examples like military juntas within, like, for example, historically Chile, where you had Augusto Pinochet ruling. Now, a military junta is probably about the closest you're going to get to a stratocracy overall. But in itself, it is not a stratocracy. Thanks for listening if you've gotten to this point. I wish we had more to talk about on this overall topic, just because it's really fascinating, but really, stratocracy is largely theoretical work, so unfortunately we don't have too much to say. Now, if you happen to be an individual who's really fascinated with the idea of Stratocracy, I really do encourage you to look into it further and see what you can explore about its ideas and concepts. Now, we definitely don't want you actually going out and trying to form revolutions or anything like that right away, but, you know, if it's something that interests you, definitely look it up. And if you liked the idea of examples of that in fiction and haven't checked out any of our 3 examples that we mentioned, which honestly would kind of surprise us a little bit, but we do encourage you to check them out. I know a lot of people say, like, oh, Starship Troopers is a book on fascism and such, but it really isn't. This is coming from someone you know who has got more of a libertarian and more cooperative NGOist and even socialist values at times telling you this. It really isn't. Not only that, but Robert Heinlein, you may actually know him if you're more on the leftist views of things, not for his military novels, but rather his novel Stranger in a Strange Land. Yeah, the guy who wrote Starship Troopers, the love letter to militarism, also wrote that book. And we're going to leave you with that thought. Because, really, that's one of the fascinating points we're trying to make here. Thank you for your time. And again, thank you for listening. If you liked what we had to say, like us, share us. If you hate it, hate us, share us. Regardless, give us a share because, well, it gets the new ideas and different thoughts out there and kind of gives another place to work with and talk about. Thank you again, and those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step. Have a great night and a pleasant tomorrow.